little bit more. Is that okay with you?
Fine.
Okay, perfect. Ah, okay, perfect. Bahar Hanım, YouTube başlamadı değil mi? Başladınız, okay. Okay, we start. Is it okay? Because YouTube also started recording.
Elif Hanım, Barış Bey bir şey yazıyor. Beni tercümanın atı. Geldi Canan Hanım, tamam.
Okay. Merhaba, hoş geldiniz. İyi Tasarım'ın bu Cuma akşamı panelinde Akdeniz konuşmalarının üçüncüsünde Raul, PINTO ve Miguel CARVALHAIS'la birlikteyiz. Ben kendilerine çok teşekkür ediyorum davetimizi kabul ettikleri için. Bir iki teknik konuda bilgilendirme yapacağım. Chat box'ımız açık ve buradan yorumlarınızı yazabilirsiniz. Eğer çok fazla yorum olursa, keşke olsa çok güzel olur. Sorularınızı ise aşağıda bulunan Q&A kısmından sorabilirsiniz. Orada birikiyor sorular ve panelin sonunda tekrar sorulacak. Başka şu anda 3 kişi görünüyoruz ekranda. Zoom'unuzun updated versiyonunu kullanmanız gerekiyor bu şekilde görebilmek için. Eğer Zoom'unuz updated bir versiyonda değilse onu update edebilirsiniz. Bir diğer konu İngilizce gerçekleşecek oturum. Türkçe olarak dinlemek istiyorsanız eğer yine ekranın altında interpretation kısmında Korece'yi tıklayarak Türkçe çeviriye ulaşabilirsiniz. Sanırım söyleyeceklerim bu kadar. Bir saniye. Kendimi çıkarıyorum ve sözü... Okay, Raul, I'm going to give the word to you now. Is that okay? Are you ready?
Am I back?
Now I'm going to spotlight you. No, I cannot actually. Okay.
I was kicked out of Zoom, so I didn't really listen to the last part. I had to come back. Çok teşekkür ederiz. Thank you for inviting us, me and Miguel. The guest is Miguel, actually, I'm just moderating, and I want to congratulate first Tasarım for keeping it up even in these strange times. Miguel is here to talk to us a little bit about what is human, non-human, machine, non-machine relationships and what's this new reality. Miguel Carvalhais, and Carvalhais might sound like a tongue twister for a Turk. It's quite a hard word to pronounce in Turkish, but he's a human and he designs, so that makes him a designer, musician. He's assistant professor in the Faculty of Fine Arts of the University of Porto. He studies computational practices and aesthetics. He's also the director of Chronicle Label for experimental music and sound, art, and the XCOAX conference for computation, communication, aesthetics, and X. I hope one of these days we can bring XCOAX to Izmir. It would be really nice. It's been spoken among us from time to time. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about predictions and speculations on this upcoming and new partnerships and collaboration between human and machines, non-human beings, and non-machines. I'm an industrial designer. I have my studio. I've been in Izmir since 2014 to 2016. Now I'm back again, and I've been working with biological generative systems And Miguel is my supervisor of the thesis that never ends, but that's a detail that can come to another time. I don't know if I can start the first question, or if Miguel, you want to say something?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. It's, you know, it's better to do it remotely as like this than to not do it at all. And you know, in these days where everything seems to be moving to online platforms, it's wonderful. You know, on one hand, it's a sign of the times and of the limitations that we have. And our conference, for instance, has been totally online last year. It will be totally online this year again. But on the other hand, you know, it actually allows us to connect people that would be very expensive to connect otherwise. So, you know, we have to see the silver lining in the current state. But it's great to be here. So thank you for having me, and I hope I'm looking forward for this conversation with you, Raul.
I'm having some glitches aside, so I don't know if it's working, but if it's not, please interrupt me and I'll repeat my previous sayings. Mm-hmm. So let's get to it. Well, the title of this is human on human, machine on machine, but when we describe something by saying that it's non-something, mm-hmm. We say that it is everything else, but not that exact thing. But the prefix non is commonly used as displacing negation, or denial, or opposition, or resistance to something. Even a lack, or something's missing when you say none, or a specific condition to something. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if a non-machine is not a machine, and a non-human is not a human, what really are they? And I'll follow on by, in case of humans, I guess when we say the non-machine, non-humans are every organic specimen that's not human. But when we're talking about machines that are non-machines, I think it's a bit confusing, this term, and it's quite fresh. So I'd start by asking you, Miguel, what is a non-machine? And can you give us some examples of what you're talking about?
I can try. Well, first of all, to give you some context, or a little bit more context, I've been heavily invested on studying what we may call computational arts, or computation only, if you want, and more specifically, the usage of computation in domains such as design or the arts. And that has led me into, you know, delving in adjacent fields like computer science for one hand, but also the philosophy of computation on the other hand. And all of this has been informing this ongoing work of developing an aesthetic view of computation, or an aesthetics of computation. So that means some sort of a philosophy of computation in the arts, and our relationship as humans to computation. And the title that, when you asked me to give a title to this conversation, I came to this human/non-human, machine/non-machine, as a sort of a provocation almost, maybe more of a provocation to me, to try to lead me, to try to force me to formalize a bunch of things I've been thinking about. And in this sense, we can kind of think of these relationships as two dipoles, or two pairs of relationships. On one hand, you have the human and the non-human, and you have a scale here. You have a scale of, oh, sorry, you were moving. You have a scale of what we may call humanity, I don't know. This scale is not only between humans and organic non-humans, as you put it, but is also between humans and pretty much everything else, be it organic or non-organic. We can think, and we will certainly talk about that later, there are objects, systems, phenomena that are absolutely non-organic, and that qualify as non-human in this relationship that we have with the world, right? And this is a word that will probably resurface later on this ecological way of relating to the world. So the distinction between humans and non-humans is mostly the distinction between us, or what is like us, and what is not and doesn't behave like us. So that's the first axis. The other axis almost works the opposite way around. It's between machine and non-machine. And this prefix non that, yes, usually defines or indicates negation or denial, but not necessarily annihilation. You know, I used it here because I've been quite influenced by, well, by two ideas that have been developed by François Raul, a French philosopher. That he talks, well, my first contact with him was in a book where he talked about the idea of non-photography. So I came through here, and then he developed some of the ideas there to a broader concept of non-philosophy, or what he calls non-philosophy, but I've heard other people call it, maybe provocatively, of non-Euclidean philosophy. And what does this mean? In this context of Raul, non-philosophy is obviously philosophy. It's still a kind of philosophy because it pursues the same goals of philosophy, but it pursues them from a very different framework, from a very different set of axioms and assumptions, becoming not a negation of philosophy, but a negation of the traditional ways of doing philosophy. Hence, the idea of the non-Euclidean philosophy. So, in this structure of dipoles, what I conceive of as a non-machine is therefore not in a strict opposition with machines, but rather it stands in a balance with them. And it stands in a continuum of variation between machines and non-machines, much in the same way as there is a continuum of variation between humans and non-humans, because there are, in the non-human universe, there are things that are closer to humans and things that are less close to humans. So just think of these as analog axes where things may be positioned. So if one thinks of a machine, and I'm using this terminology here because I'm particularly interested in, relating with our preconceptions and our, to the preconceptions and to the general ideas that are present in the culture about terms such as machine. A machine is a device. I don't know. I guess that the Wikipedia entry for a machine is something like a device that uses power to apply forces and control movement, or something along these lines. And this is, of course, a word that we've been using for a really long time that describes anything from, the 6 simple machines from classical Greece, like the lever, the wheel, the axle, blah, blah, blah, until, all the millions of other machines that we live with nowadays. And now, of course, that this universe can be analyzed in many different ways, but one thing I use that I use very often because I find it like a particularly neat way of organizing a typology of machines is what the model that Alan Turing published in 48. Maybe in his Intelligent Machinery paper, where he talks about continuous machines on one hand, discrete machines on the other hand, and then he separates them into controlling machines or active machines, meaning information-only machines or actual physical machines. But regardless of these, machines usually have determinate functions, they have determinate tasks, and we think of them along those lines. We use machines to develop particular tasks. We use machines as deterministic and predictable mechanisms or predictable things. We use machines as reducible things. And then, of course, habitats like mechanical have been seeping into our culture because, you know, when we talk about something being mechanical, we expect it to be machine-like, to be determinable and reducible as a machine is. We expect it to be extremely organized, and we expect it to be, you know, unconscious, a being in itself. So that's it. And when I think about non-machines, I kind of think about the reverse of all of this. So I think about mostly machinic things, although they can be organic too, but systems that have a behavior and a nature that is substantially different from machines. You know, and I don't call them machines not because they are not artificial. Of course, they are artificial, but rather because they are very much unlike most other machines. You know, a non-machine is irreducible. What do I mean with irreducible? I mean that you cannot predict its behavior with 100% certainty. You cannot, much as you can't do with a human, you cannot anticipate their behavior, right? You can to a certain point through theory of mind, but you cannot, what I mean is that you cannot anticipate it as you do on a mechanical device. This is the idea of reducibility, you know, of developing shortcuts to a system's future behavior, output, etc., etc. So I think of non-machines as systems that are irreducible in this sense. I think of them as systems that are disorganized, or at least start by being disorganized and then are able to organize themselves, you know. So if you think about this in the Lowesian terms, they go from catatonic to becoming a full body without organs, you know. And I think of them as systems that are potentially autopoietic, that are potentially able to develop themselves, to shape themselves, and to influence their future, so to have agency. So I think of non-machines as systems that have no determinate function or functions necessarily, that are universal in the same sense as computers are universal, you know, or Turing machines are universal, meaning that they can be repurposed. They are general. They are hopefully generalistic. You know, so that means that non-machines are most likely computational, at least nowadays. And they, because of all of these affordances and because of all these features, they tend to approach the organic and to approach the human, because in a sense, you know, if you think about these two parallel scales, the human is also a non-machine, you know, because we are also machinic in a way, you know. It depends. It's a let's say that it's a good perspective to look at us as a machine, but we develop all these behaviors. So in a more down-to-earth way of defining it, you know, thinking about current practices in design or in visual arts or in the arts in general, we can think about non-machines as, you know, what Alvanoe calls of strange tools. Tools that do not organize us, but tools that reorganize us, or that we can use to become to reorganize ourselves. You know, of course, that if we look at this from all these perspectives, non-machines do not exist at this point. You know, they are. This is an idealized concept that's at the end of the scale. But not only, I think they are a potential, they are a possibility, but we start seeing many systems being developed that become closer to this idea of a non-machine, or to this concept of a non-machine, and that start behaving in ways that are extremely different from what we normally expect from machines. And because of that, we are forced to, you know, as designers, as artists, as media creators or media scholars, we are forced to question many of our assumptions, and we are forced to rethink, substantially rethink, how we interact with our media and with our technology. So I hope I have replied.
More or less. I mean, you could have an example, then at the end we can talk about it, maybe about other things, but you're talking a lot about how non-machines relate to the organic in many ways. And this includes humans. Maybe it's more easy for us to think about ourselves. When we establish a relationship, most of the times it's kind of a interpretation of the way we feel our surroundings, right? Something that's interacted with us through our senses. Non-machines and machines don't really have, it's not really interpretation of a sense how could I put this? It's not really a new interpretation of something. Okay, we get input from the environment and we relate to it in a new way every time. A machine is known to be consistent. To give us all that. Non-machines, for what I got here, are not consistent in this relationship. So I'm maybe going to mix. I had two questions here for you, but maybe I'm going to mix them both, because you already spoke a little bit about this idea of agency that Philip Ball says that all living matter has agency in the sense from a cell to an organism. So from the smallest known element of a living organism has agency. That agency, he says, is the ability of living entities to alter their environment and themselves with purpose to suit an agenda. What if a non-machine doesn't have this feeling and able to interpret feelings? Feelings, I'm saying all the senses kind of thing. How would you say that these things relate? I mean, what's similar to the organic and what's different?
Well, that goes back to, so the similarities between the organic and the artificial, they have been studied. I can't remember since when, but at least since cybernetics came around after the Second War, right? So this idea that control and communication is fundamental both to the organic and the mechanical, or the machinic, is at the core of cybernetics, and it's something that is, I guess, at the core of the computational too, and at the core of what nowadays we call AI, or artificial intelligence. And it's all about information exchanges. It's all about communication, really. Not necessarily what we define more colloquially as communication, not necessarily about using natural language to talk with each other or sending coded signs via whatever carrier, but it's about exchanges of information between systems. And information is not energy. Information is not matter. Information is something else altogether. Information is coded in matter and energy, but it's a different, it's a different plane of existence, so to speak. It's a different material. So agency, whether we regard non-machines as being organic or synthetic, agency is something they certainly may have, or they certainly have, if you think about the end of the scale, okay? And this is like thinking about, I don't know, consciousness in humans, non-humans. It's something that may exist on the far end of the scale, right? And may not exist in the low end of the scale. And it may exist at a varying degree in between. So, if you have a chicken, there's some consciousness there, for sure. If you have a dog, there's probably way more. If you have a toddler, way more. And if you have a human, ideally, you have a lot of it. But agency is pretty much the same. You may not have agency at all in some machines, and you may have quite a bit of agency on non-machines. An agency understood as the capacity, I can't remember how you defined it, the ability to shape our environment. So the ability
to shape themselves and the environment with a purpose,
the ability
an agenda.
to act. I mean, the word agenda is kind of charged.
That's why I'm emphasizing it.
Exactly. No, it's kind of charged because an agenda, you know, if you anthropomorphize the word, an agenda implies something like forethought. It implies planning and strategizing, and you know, it implies the ability to. It implies imagination, for instance, like to think ahead into the future. Whereas agency in itself can be something far more short-term. You know, you can have very simple drives, like you can have, say, very simple animals or plants that have extremely simple drives and have agency within some of those drives. You know, they are able to alter themselves and alter their environment in ways that, you know, at our human scale may seem kind of simple, but nevertheless, agency is there. Now, of course, that if we think about non-machines, we can think about them having a great deal of agency, especially if we, you know, and as we are a little bit in the realm of speculation, especially if we consider things like artificial general intelligences that may or may not come around sometime in the future, right? So you can't think about an intelligent system if there is no agency there, because I think that an intelligent system must have agency. Otherwise it's a brain in a vat. You know, it may be potentially intelligence, but if it has no agency, then yeah, for all practical purposes. Now, because information and communication is so important, you know, when we think about three of these four things, when we think about humans, non-humans, and machines, we have a set of, you know, established relationships that we have been developing since forever. Well, not forever, but since a really long time. So we have the relationships between humans and non-humans, organic non-humans, and then there's a different set of relationships between humans and non-organic non-humans, you know, and between humans and machines, and even between machines and non-humans, right? There's still a lot of work to do there, but it's definitely something that is both historically and culturally relevant, and there are a bunch of people doing super interesting work nowadays in, say, computer-animal interaction, for instance. Now, when we think about non-machines, we need to start thinking that in this regime of computation, to paraphrase or to quote actually Catherine Ailes, we start sharing our world with not only non-humans and machines, but also with non-machines. So we need to develop a set of new relationships that are absolutely new for us, you know, like relationships between ourselves and non-machines, but also relationships between non-machines and machines, non-machines and non-humans, and also between non-machines and other non-machines. Because we cannot think about non-machines as something homogeneous, right? We can think of a plurality, a diversity of non-machines, and they will most likely need to communicate amongst themselves. So I think that our relationships with all these parties must become solidary. And what I mean with this, I mean that we cannot allow ourselves to develop exploitative relationships with all of these things, be it with the ones that already exist, non-humans and machines. But also,
just understand, you say we cannot exploit machines.
We should not. I mean, what I'm saying is that whenever we think about us relating with everything, you know, with the non-human, with the machinic, and with non-machines, we should start from the, you know, we should start from the idea that we should not be exploitative. Of course, that the nature of our relationship with machines is exploitative. We build machines to serve us, very literally. And, you know, I really have nothing against that in principle, as long as, because we develop that sort of relationship with machines, we don't end up, as a consequence, developing exploitative relationships with non-human, non-organic systems. Like, you know, like we do not destroy the planet in order to build machines, for example. But the thing is, as soon as we start moving in this axis from machine to non-machine, then we need to start worrying about the sort of relationship that we want to develop with those systems. Do we want non-machines, say, do we want artificial intelligences to be slaves to us? Maybe, but are we comfortable with that idea if artificial intelligences at some point become conscious? I don't know. Probably not. You know, or I'd wager probably not. But even, and because throwing consciousness to discussions such as these is always risky, because we don't know whether that is possible or not. I mean, we don't even know what consciousness is. It's very hard to define it even in humans. But regardless of whether consciousness is there or not, the ethical problem is not very different, because what we've been finding out is that in our relationships with non-machines, so let me put this another way. What we've been finding is that we start developing intersubjective relationships with non-machines. And this is something we don't develop with machines. I mean, we anthropomorphize them, of course, right? We have a machine that's not working and we may say it's angry or it's outing or something like that, but we don't really believe that. That's just a shortcut, you know, to our relationship with the machine. But we, of course, have developed intersubjective relationships with humans, or with most humans, and we develop intersubjective relationships with non-humans, like especially with animals, but not exclusively with animals. Now, with non-machines, we will, actually, I think we already do, we do develop some form of intersubjective relationship. This may be just because we project subjectivity to the system, you know, and in this sense, we're kind of anthropomorphizing it. I don't think it's the exact same thing, or I don't think it's as simple as that, but because when we are in a relationship, in a communication, in a communicative relationship with a system that is irreducible, with a system that is very complex and that is non-deterministic, then we are programmed to start developing some sort of the mind of that system, to start developing some sort of psychology of that system, right? So our relationship with that system automatically becomes intersubjective because we project the subject there, even if the subject is not there. And that shapes or should shape our relationship with the system. So that means, and that's why I talk about this care that we need to have about not developing exploitative relationships, much as we need to when we, establish relationships with other humans that so often become exploitative too. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I was listening, you're kind of saying that non-machines are not here yet. It's something that's coming. I feel like it's coming. The pattern kind of gives us some hints. Is it like...
I don't want to sound like a futurist, so, I don't want to sound like Ray Kurzweil or something. So maybe I prefer not to say they're coming. I think they're a possibility. Whether they're coming or not, it's beyond my pay grade, so to speak. But
I was wondering actually if they're not here already and we're not seeing them. A little bit like Timothy Morton introduced the concept of hyperobjects. No one saw them as objects. And non-machines sound a lot like Timothy Morton's description of a hyperobject. First, I'd like to know if you agree with that. But when I read Timothy Morton's hyperobjects, it seems like he describes hyperobject like a consequence of something that wasn't perceived or unperceived consequence of a system, or elements of a system that kind of get patterned up and have an agenda. Let's say, like we could say pollution in that sense has an agenda, right? It gets together, it reacts, it does something. Do you see non-machines like that? Do you question if they are already around and we're just not seeing them? I'm kind of looking at your background and I'm seeing how it interacts with you, and no one kind of programmed it all, and it has a life of its own. And is your background a non-machine?
No, the filter from Zoom is a
it's a filter from Zoom, a non-machine in a sense.
Yeah. So I don't know how to. Okay. Yeah, let's talk about hyperobjects first. Objects, before defining hyperobjects, objects can be thought of as, well, if you subscribe to OOO, to object-oriented ontology, which is something that deeply informs Timothy Morton, then objects are something that is different from their parts. That's it. It's as simple as that. Because for OOO, everything are objects, and you can talk about an object when it's something different from the objects that constitute it. Not more than the sum of its parts, because very often, an object is less than its parts. But that's a different story. Now, hyperobjects that were theorized or described by Morton a few years ago, I can't remember from when the book is, but 2000 something. They are a class of objects that have particular characteristics, and they are characterized by, according to Morton, and this is the terminology that he uses, I think, hyperobjects are viscous, and that means that they stick to things that get involved with them. They have this residue, this attrition to things. They are non-local, meaning that they have, of course, local manifestations here and there, but any local manifestation of a hyperobject is not the object itself. It's just that, a local manifestation. Then they also are, and I really like this description, they are temporally undulating, because they, according to Morton, they involve profoundly different temporalities than those in our humble human scale. We are more or less at the middle of the scale of the universe, and it's very, very different for us to understand the extremes. In terms of scale, dimensional and temporal scales, and in terms of a number of other things. And then, because of this, they do what Morton describes as phasing, meaning that they are in a high dimensional plane or phase space, I guess it's best to describe like this, that results in these hyperobjects being effectively invisible to us for most of the time, or always, or for big stretches of time. So finally, and as a consequence of all of this, hyperobjects exhibit their effects interobjectively, meaning that they can be detected in a space that consists of interrelationships between aesthetic properties of objects. And this then relates to the entire OOO theory that, that Graham Harman explains beautifully in some of his books. And by the way, that he relates with aesthetics and with art in really interesting ways. So to conclude, according to Morten, a hyperobject is not a function of our knowledge because it's hyper relative to everything and not only to us, okay? Or to many other things and not only to us. And some examples that Morten gives of hyperobjects are things like, to start with more simple things, planets or galaxies, to start with more complex things, more complex than a galaxy, well, or things that for us seem more complex, global warming, for instance. Understood, or the entire climate and this catastrophe of global warming understood as a hyperobject. So I think that non-machines are almost certainly hyperobjectual or hyperobjectual. I did some work not so long ago with Rosemary Lee about, about looking at computer art, not necessarily artificial intelligence produced art or art produced with artificial intelligence, but any computer art really as hyperobjective or hyperobjectual. And we actually managed to, to correlate these 6 properties of hyperobjects to computational art. And I should precise, not computer art, but computational art. So not necessarily art done by involving computers somehow, but art where computation is the art form, right? Whether or not computers are there. So, and why? Because, well, first of all, because the relationship we establish with computation and with non-machines is intersubjective, as we were just talking a few minutes ago. Then it becomes viscous, because from the moment you project subjectivity, from the moment you start thinking, start developing something akin to a theory of mind, you start thinking with the other system or person's head. So if I develop a theory of mind of you, then I'm, thinking inside your head or trying to simulate it. So after that, you stay with me. So if I'm emulating, if I'm trying to simulating some other system, the system stays with me. And I take it with me. It stays somehow. So it affects me, and there's this viscosity. And the same way you can think about non-locality, because there's this split between, what Friedrich Nacke calls the subface of a computational system versus its surface. So whatever computation is going on and how it's manifested physically or sensorially. So what goes on in the chip versus, or in the motherboard versus what goes on in the screen, or what goes on in whatever outputs of the system. Okay. So yeah, to summarize this, I think, because I don't think it's necessary to go on over the other things like temporary undulation, phasing, etc. I do think that non-machines are hyperobjective, hyperobjectual, sorry. And of course that because of our recent technology, or more recent technology, hyperobjects have lost some of their invisibility. And we are now aware of them because we can visualize them. But mostly, I guess more important than being able to visualize them is being able to conceive of them, is being able to philosophically imagine them first. Yeah.
That leads me to the question that, Miguel, you ran away from the answer.
No, I forgot. Sorry.
The key question was, do you think that, before I move to the next one, just yes or no, do you think that hyperobject non-machines are already around? We just haven't been able to visualize them or to grasp their essence?
Yes, I was not trying to run away from it because I did some notes about it. I just forgot. They may be. They may very well be, or, I mean, again, it's not the end of the scale, but there are several systems that are non-machines, you know, and some of them are maybe obvious to us. You think about GPT-3, for instance. Yeah, it's a non-machine, right? Mm-hmm. You think about advanced AI systems. You think about AlphaZero. Maybe, maybe not. But what about financial systems? What about micro trading systems used in banking? You know, that are worldwide, that are temporally undulating, that are non-local, they are viscous, they certainly affect all of us. You know, yeah, I think non-machines are there. Now, you know, I'm more, as a humble designer that was trained to, you know, in a philanthropic way of designing. So meaning that we're trying to develop products and systems that, you know, improve humanity, that, as they say in Silicon Valley, make the world a better place. I don't think they are accessible to us much in the same way as computation wasn't accessible to us a few years ago. Electricity wasn't accessible before that, etc. But they will most certainly become, you know, a very important part of our lives, of our personal, domestic lives, you know, sometime very soon, I think.
Thanks. And Miguel, you did bring us to our last question, that is bringing it to the subject of design. Mm-hmm. I mean, John Mayer has been advocating for a long time that design has to fuse with computation. There's no future for design without computation. Okay, I'm exaggerating. Mm-hmm. Future is a bit big to say, but still. And he says that this will reduce intuitiveness in the design process, but will increase wiredness and will increase strangeness. Does this mean that design in general has to be rethought? Just that designing for this non-machine, non-human shifts is a new category of design. So, how do we design for these non-humans and non-machines? Also the opposite. How do we design for humans coexisting with these non-things? So is design in the common futures, and it brings it down to the subject of the panel. And I didn't call it common futures, like the name of the Tasarım. I call it common future as one, a subject that considers everything as one thing, and design stopped being something that gives solutions, but something that tampers a system and kind of guides a system, or slowly taps the way to an idea more than a solution.
Mm. Yeah. So it's funny because I was remembering how Max Benzer talked about, you know, back in the 50s, 60s, 60s. He talked about, when talking about computer graphics or computer art, he talked about randomness as a way to simulate or to inject into computer art what he called the intuitiveness of the human approach to producing images, or the intuitive aspects of the human approach. And Maeda, you know, he has for a really long time been talking about that, about how computation can be used in art production or design production. More recently, in his latest book, what's the title? How to Speak Computer, something like that. He actually advocates this idea that all design nowadays should be an intersection between graphic design, design thinking, and computational design, which I kind of sympathize with, except for the design thinking bit. That is always...
Anyway. Man has to get a living.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't think design thinking is relevant there, but I do truly subscribe to this idea that, you know, to do design nowadays, whether for non-machines or for machines or for any other medium, you know, we live in this post-digital world where computation is everywhere, or at least affected everything. So we cannot design nowadays if we don't think computationally too, right? That does not mean, even if you're designing non-computational things, you have to think about a relationship with computational things, because it's a computational world. That's it. It's something that needs to become, intuitive for us. It's like we don't think, when we design, there's so much we don't consider because it's deeply intuitive for us as humans, or for us as humans in the 21st century, and when I come from a communication design background, so I did my share of designing books and print publications and working with typography, etc., etc., etc. And there's a lot that you learn while going through the motions of, getting your undergrad in communication design, and all of what you learn are the non-intuitive things. If you come to think of it, the really important things when it comes to building, say, a book layout, you don't discuss because you take them as granted. Because you and your professors and your colleagues and the people that will read the book have been living with that technology for half a millennium, right? And with non-machines or with machinic media or computational media, most of what goes on is non-intuitive, is absolutely new for us. And we actually need to, understand them from the basis, from the basics. We need to develop a very different way of thinking to be able to design for these systems. I don't know if that is even the right way of put it, if it's designing for non-machines or designing with non-machines, because we design objects, that humans will use. We design systems that humans will use. And although we are humans, we are, our knowledge of other humans is pretty incomplete. We share a lot with each other, like we were all born and grew up, and we know that we will all die someday, and that somehow shapes our psychology quite a bit. So that means we have a deep understanding of what being human is, but we don't have a deep understanding of what being another human is. So, and that's why over the last 40, 50 years, methodologies like human-centered design flourished, because we figured out that when we're working with non-intuitive media and non-intuitive contexts, then we can't take other humans for granted. We need to actually develop ways to figure them out better, to study them, so that then we can deploy systems, we can design systems that work for them. And then beyond human-centered design, we came to co-design and participatory design and all those methodologies that actually try to involve the people that will be the users, or the users of the systems we're designing. So maybe thinking about designing for the deeply unintuitive, for the non-machine, for that which we are not able to understand directly, and maybe like getting a cue from Thomas Nagel and from his discussion of what it's like to be a bat. It's sometimes things that we are not only we're not able to understand, and as we are not able even to imagine. So how do you develop empathy and solidarity and an ecological thinking towards these things? I don't know. I think we really need a revolution in not in design thinking, but in thinking about design. Revolution in designing. We need to try to resonate with the non-machine and the non-human, and maybe try to design with the non-machine instead of designing for. You know?
Thank you, Miguel. I think it was an interesting conversation that lets more questions than gives answers, but I think that would be expected.
Mission accomplished.
Exactly. But we do have a question from Daniel Savasta, so we can move on maybe to the Q&R. It's a very interesting one because I was thinking about something similar, so I'm going to put two questions in one, Danielle and mine. So Danielle asks, when I see the opposition of human, non-human, and machine, non-machine, I inevitably think of Gremy's semiotic square with life, non-life, and death, non-death. Have you established the title with this in mind? And consequently, what about the relationship among non-human and life and machine and death? I was thinking, just to add on, that it seems like we're always talking about the machine becoming wilder and wilder, and the organic becoming more and more domesticated. So I think it kind of, I don't know, it's two very worlds. I'd like you to speculate a little bit about this idea. First, if you had this in mind when it was based on Grammy's.
Short answer, no. So I didn't have this in mind, but thank you, Daniele, because this makes a lot of sense. So maybe to start with, you know, what we've been doing as humans since a really long time, you know, like our evolutionary history, in a sense, is about domestication, domesticating animal species, even domesticating us. I can't remember where I read that maybe we were domesticated by wheat and not the other way around, right? But this idea of, you know, fighting against irreducibility, fighting against indeterminacy, fighting against chaos, and fighting against, you know, uncertainty is something that certainly defines us as humans, maybe because we're fighting against death, ultimately. That's, you know, we are fighting against entropy. So that's what we do as humans, or that's what we do as biological beings. So, but I didn't have that in mind, but it really makes a lot of sense to think about this scale between life on one hand and death on the other hand, or maybe, you know, or maybe non-life, to use another negative, because death is a concept that implies life, at least for me. I don't think you can think about death if there is not its opposite life. Now, you can think about something that is neither. And when you think about, unless you really subscribe to, I don't know, to James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, you know, and you think about the non-organic as being alive, in a sense, then, yeah, then it really becomes hard for me to think about life and death in the machinic phylum, so to speak. But once you have autopoietic systems, on the other hand, once you have systems that become, I don't know, self-aware in some way, conscious in some way, you know, even, and I'm not necessarily talking about AGI and, you know, and human level intelligence and stuff like that, that so far are from the realm of science fiction. But once you have systems that are able to integrate enough information to have some sort of a model of themselves and a model of themselves in the world, and that have agency and that have, you know, some sort of memory, then you can talk about something that is on its way to becoming, you know, comparable to life in some senses, to life in some senses. Yeah. But that's something, well, thank you for the question, Danielle, because that's definitely food for thought.
I don't know if you have any other questions. Our time is also kind of up.
Okay.
Elif, should we conclude? You want to add any question? I don't know if there's any. I don't think there's any more questions that I can.
Hello again.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, I'm going to put myself back. So I can't ask a question in the Q&A because I'm also in the panelist session. Thank you very much. Yes, I realized that. Thank you very much for the this panel. We still have time, actually. We can get more questions, but before your talk, we always question this with also Raul, because this is called Mediterranean talks. And I was really thinking, can we really talk about also such things, in a way geographically, or like how can you put these common features in a, what I mean geographically is more like, you know, sharing this similar challenges or like being close to one another. We were because when we started the Mediterranean talks, we were just thinking that in order to talk about contribute in a way globally, you're around. So to say something, why don't we first of all speak among ourselves like the Mediterranean groups so that we have a word for it for globally. It's really difficult in your topic. Of course, it's really also philosophically talking, but would it be such a thing? Just a question just to consider. I don't know if I put it in a right way. What do you think, Raul, or as we have discussed?
Yes, I think there is this dimension of space that's very human also. You know, we have this perception that we belong to the Mediterranean, whatever that is. Again,
it's, you know, in a sense, it's a bit non-local because, curiously, well, I'm in Portugal, as you know.
You're not in the Mediterranean.
We tend to think of ourselves as a Mediterranean country. But if I look outside my window, I see the Atlantic, not the Mediterranean. We do not touch the Mediterranean at all, but our entire culture is deeply Mediterranean because, well, everyone has been here at some time, you know, during the last 2,000 years. Or everyone from the Mediterranean has been here and has left a mark and an impression. And that's where we were born from, so to speak, or born as a local culture. So in that sense, we're profoundly non-local too. And we share this, you know, we also share this thing of being Southern Europeans and not Northern Europeans. So of always having belonged to the peripheries, which, you know, it's something that we probably used to resent up until very recently, but that nowadays it's kind of becoming an asset instead of, it's actually becoming something good. And that's also, you know, due to many factors, including computational media and including these amazing technologies like this one we're using right now, that seem, you know, they seem effectively magical, and they profoundly transformed, and they, if anything, they haven't transformed enough. They haven't transformed to their true potential, our ways of being in the world and of relating with each other. So because of this, I think that we can finally start escaping that, you know, that attraction to the big industrial centers and economical centers in the north, or well, or in the south in my case, because I'm not even in the capital of Portugal, I'm in the second city. So, you know, a few years ago, a few years ago, not even a generation, you know, the main attractor would be for me to travel 300 kilometers to the south, because that's where things happened. You know, nowadays they actually, of course, that there are many things that need to happen locally, but they happen locally in a more vibrant way because they can also happen globally at the same time. You know, and I think that we Mediterraneans, if you allow me to use the title, you know, or to abuse the title, I think that it's it's a really great opportunity for us, you know, and for other peripheries like Latin America, for instance, or South America, you know, to actually start to gain another dynamics out of this, you know, another cultural dynamics and another social dynamics. I don't know if that replied to the question.
No, I think so. I mean, it's really interesting to think of this digital cultures and where we are going to, and because we think that it's become so global, but it's not tangible. I somehow, as a human being, tend to touch it so that I understand and speak of something about planetary or in that way, I would say.
Another interesting thing, as a side note, another interesting thing that we've been experimenting here or experiencing here in Spain, you know, Southern Europe, is that of the expats that work remotely to, you know, either to distributed companies or to, you know, companies that have their headquarters in Germany or whatever, Sweden, etc. But that they don't need people to work locally. They allow their workers to work full-time remote. So they can actually come to a place where, you know, you don't freeze for half of the year and you have nice weather and, you know, more affordable housing and effectively, you know, commute electronically to their jobs. And that's also a pretty interesting phenomenon that is very recent. So I really don't know how that will develop, but I've been seeing signs of people even, especially now with the pandemics, when people are forced to work remotely, and some companies are, you know, actually shifting their modus of operation, their MO to remote. I've started seeing signs here of people just moving to, you know, to their ancestral cities or villages because they have family places there that they use as weekend homes or vacation homes. And I've seen people going back and living full-time there because as long as you have a fast web connection, why do you need to be in the city with, you know, all the noise and pollution and COVID around you? So, yeah.
It's
listening.
Similar here. I mean, I know my colleagues, they're moving to villages, you know, here it's especially here around villages, summer houses, and the city is just as the opposite, because now it's really interesting because cities are more there than the nations, you know, it was becoming, you tend to hear the city names, but now with the pandemic, it's really interesting. I started to see the cities as the nations, but now people are moving out of the cities and more in the peripheries or like in the villages and so on. I find it really interesting in this shift. Sorry, Raul, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to add that I was listening to you and you were saying that people are going to less crowded places, so they're more grounded, let's say. But they actually communicate in a way that's broader because technology allows it. And it sounds like a very fertile land for non-machines to grow. Because all communication's going, something's happening. Most of it we don't understand. The other day I was reading that sending a Google search weights is not the same energy as putting a light bulb on for a second. I didn't have this notion of how much energy was being lost in the system, and things that we didn't see become visible now. And do you think that our culture, like being in Mediterranean, and because non-machines are viscous, they'll be influenced by what they touch. Not only influenced what they touch, they'll be influenced by what they touch. I don't know, just trying to bring this back to the idea that if we don't start designing it now or thinking about designing it now, it might happen the same as the hyper objects and it's too late and we don't know how to reverse engineer these problems. They burst up.
Yeah, that's true. That is very true. And that is something we've been, we've been worried with because you are also working on this. And it's something that even in my teaching work, I try to keep present. I always try to keep these, under focus. We need to think differently about these things. On one hand, it helps me in that I teach design at a fine arts school where you have a bunch of artists, and artists are, one of their specialties is to think about this, is to think about this reorganization. But it doesn't help me that at the same time I teach design in a school filled with old school designers, classical designers, graphic designers only, and again, I come from a graphic design background, but, for generational happenstance, I've always designed computationally because I've always designed with computers. So, and I totally understand how someone that didn't do that may work in very, very different ways, and may understand the world in very different ways. And what we need is to learn what we can from those practices, but we really need to reorganize those practices. We really need to look at the world and look at the way how we do design and how we create products, how we create information, and ultimately how we create culture out of that. We need a revolution in the way we do design. And, some people are doing that work for sure, but it's still not as generalized as it should be right now.
Bringing that even more to the Mediterranean Sea, we don't have any other questions. I was curious about your opinion about what Elif was saying. We define ourselves as Mediterranean because we feel similar in culture. Mm-hmm. Kind of the same thing. Our languages are similar. They have affinities. The way we interact with other humans. I mean, all these things make us feel Mediterranean. Do you think that this feeling can be passed on if everything is very digital? How do we pass this Mediterranean vibe? Do we code different? Do we design digitally different? Because the way we represent things, like painters, are very different when you see them geographically. Like they have a language, they have a school. But coding is universal. So many times we're saying it's not media, but it's not matter based. So it doesn't seem to be viscous enough to absorb this. How do we make it more viscous, or should we not do it? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, when it comes to coding, I'm definitely not a computer scientist, nor an informatics engineering or a developer. I think that, but I do code, and my students do code quite a bit. But I don't think code is that universal. I think code is an artificial language. And as any language, it has the potential, or maybe the ideal of being universal. But then it's such a multifaceted tool that it can be used in so many different ways. And that's the richness of languages, including Portuguese or English or Turkish or C++, I guess. There's not a single directed way of writing code. There are many languages and there are many ways of using the language.
So are there accidents to this code?
Idioms, yeah, I would say so. And also, nothing stops you from actually devising new languages. There's this really interesting project that this American artist, Daniel Temkin, has been developing for a few years. He calls it ESOLangs, or Esoteric Languages. And it compiles and invents programming languages. Fully functional programming languages that are very esoteric. He regards it as an artistic practice to develop new programming languages. And ultimately, code is universal. And I was just seeing what Danielle had posted on the Q&A, said code might be universal so far. Code is universal in the sense that it
it programs the universal computing machine, right? Because ultimately code is compiled into assembler or whatever low-level language, and that actually talks to the Turing machine. But there are so many ways of coding the same thing. Like there are so many ways of expressing the same thing with natural language. You know? And
I mean, you can say that we are encoded, right? With DNA, we are encoded in a sense.
Oh,
the code's there. I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. Okay, that's
let's not go there unless we have another couple of hours.
That's good.
But no, but what I was going to say is that we humans, we really delve in these small things. We love these small things. We love these small details of expression, you know. So because we depend on this aesthetic experience, you know, our relationship with everything, with the world, with our reality, with each other is aesthetic, and it's fundamentally hinged on these nuances, you know? And these nuances are really difficult to express and formalize. You know, it's like, what makes us Mediterranean? I don't know. It may be olive oil, of course. It may be because we have, you know, a better suntan than people in Northern Europe. But it's not that, right? It's that feeling of familiarity that you get once you set foot, say, in Turkey, you know, where everything is very different from Portugal, but at the same time, it's eerily familiar. But you can't put a finger there. You know, you can't point to this or that thing. But it's this holistic feeling that you don't get in other places. No.
Oh, okay.
Wow,
Thank you, Miguel.
That was really, really nice. I mean, saying this, so we need to, I mean, I would love to invite you to İzmir then and to share this Mediterraneanness, and I guess it's the, I don't know, what nurture us, what the weather, the climate, you know, the agriculture, whatever is there, and we are nurtured in a similar way. So I guess that brings all of us in a way familiar with something. And we would be really happy to invite you to İzmir to share this Mediterranean life, I would say, at a night or like, I don't know, like a couple of days, hopefully next time. And also I saw that Daniele wrote something about X-Covax, when are we doing it in İzmir and so on. That could be a good opportunity. Now see.
Hope soon.
I hope so. That'd be really, really nice. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm so happy to have met you in the end.
Likewise.
Thank you so much, Raul. I know you are now, and also bon voyage. You're now going to Portugal. I know.
Inshallah.
That. Inshallah, yes. Please say hi to your family. And thank you for listening. Bizi dinlediğiniz için çok teşekkür ederiz. I would like to show one thing before we leave to our guests. I always confuse to speak English or Turkish at this. But okay, this is the one. Let me show. I think, I don't know how I'm going to show it. I'm going to share my screen and okay. Yarın saat 1'de müşterekleşme pratiği olarak kent postanlarını konuşacağız. Moderatörümüz Ali Kemal Ertem, Ömer Selvi, yarın Pelin Tan, Arca Atay, Çağlayan Deniz Kaplan'ı ağırlıyoruz. Bizimle birlikte olursanız çok mutlu oluruz. Diyeyim. Okay, stop sharing. Çok teşekkür. Thank you again so much, and so see you hopefully sometime soon. Okay.
Likewise. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.